Hello and welcome to GuyLogicGaming. My name is Temco and this is Vikings Wolves of Midgard, developed by Games Farm and published by Calypso Media Digital. It is a hack and slash ARPG set with Vikings and a lot of butchering and bludgeoning and mayhem in general. It's an isometric style game much like in the vein of Diablo, Grim Dawn or Path of Exile, but with a different setting and a little bit of a different twist in certain areas. And before we dive into anything and everything related to that, let's go ahead and dive into some options, talk a little bit about the PC performance, settings and optimizations, and stuff like that. First things first, options wise, we want to go into video options, but sadly there are none. Now while I can understand there being a more limited set of options due to the isometric nature of the game, no options at all is quite unacceptable. There is no AA, no shadow, no anisophicity, no graphical detail, no texture quality. There's nothing here. This is not acceptable. Yes, sure, gamma correction is here, but there isn't really even a way to change the in-game's windowed or full screen mode or even a resolution. There is a small launcher when your game loads up where you can change presets and stuff like that. So it is a little bit available, but not having any of that in-game is not a good thing for a game in 2017 at all. Heading back to that and heading to audio, we have a full set of audio menus, master effects, music, ambient, and voice over. Though the game does keep playing music even when you alt-tab, and though I am a limited use case that annoys that sort of thing, it would have still been nice to either have a toggle or disable that when the game gets alt-tabbed. But that doesn't happen, so you will hear the music non-stop even when alt-tabbed. But the overall settings menu for itself is pretty good. The music overall is pretty decent and varied. Overall, no real complaints on this part. Gameplay wise, there are a couple of options you can turn on or off. Helmets, damage numbers, health bars, and subtitles. I would turn on subtitles even though everything is voice acted. They still provide a little bit extra detail. And especially in the heat of combat, some of the things the character says are just hilarious and great, and even gender specific, that do provide a little bit of extra flair. And if you're fighting and hearing a lot of sounds at the same time, subtitles being on does add a little bit more to the immersion when you can read that. Other than that, it's not really that impressive of a gameplay settings menu. I would have liked to see more things such as colorblind mode for example, but that is all not available. If we head on into controls, there's my last weird little thing here, is that, well, some of these grayed out menu items cannot be rebound, while some of these others can be. So it's really strange that I cannot rebind my menu from escape to something else, or change zoom from my scroll wheel, or maybe my page down or page up. Chat is not defined, and there is no way to define it because you can't alter this binding. It's a little bit weird. These other bindings can be changed, so if you want to move your skill set from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to maybe QWERTY or something like that, if you're used to that sort of thing from MOBAs, that is possible, but a lot of the other stuff really isn't. Also, movement is obviously mouse driven, so left mouse moves you, right mouse attacks you, but you can directionally roll without changing direction of your attacks using W, A, S, and D keys, which is something I do like the game has added. And lastly, we have the credits menu overall. Performance-wise, the game runs at a smooth 60 FPS, but because you can't change any options, if you can't hit 60, you're kind of stuck as you are. Now, there are a couple of spots here and there where certain particle effects and environmental effects do dip the frame rate somewhat below, but these are very few and far in between. So overall, decent optimization and overall decent performance for this game in general. The caveat I want to add here, as I said, is because there is basically no graphical option to speak of in the game, outside of a little bit of a launcher window, is that if you are not happy with certain settings and certain things being available in the game, you're sort of stuck with what you are. And the graphical fidelity, while not bad, is not exactly excellent. The game still does not compare to games like Grim Dawn that have been out for a few years now, or things like Diablo 3 that, while has a much larger budget and a much larger studio behind it, still compares many years after release to this game coming out right now, and I'm not the greatest fan of that. Now don't get me wrong, it's not that this game looks bad in any way, shape or form, but it could look better, and having the option for players to customize how much they want to hand in performance versus graphical fidelity would have been nice, and the game doesn't allow that. That's a damn shame. The game also offers a multiplayer co-op campaign where you can play the campaign with a friend in 2-player co-op. While I haven't had the chance to play a lot of multiplayer, the little bit of experience seems to work fine and excellent, though obviously, as always, multiplayer should always be noted after release when the big influx of player comes in and stresses the servers and connectivity issues might ensue. So do keep in mind to check that after the game releases if you are mostly going to play multiplayer. If you're playing single player, you can ignore this and just continue on. continuing on, we shall let's go ahead and dive into the game and talk all about the various things that make up this ARPG and whether or not it can rival games like Grim Dawn and Diablo and, well, Path of Exiles. Let's go ahead and dive in. Diving into gameplay, the comparison to Diablo and Path of Exile is easily laid. The same type of movement and combat mechanics, as well as the same general fantasy-esque art style, are readily apparent in this phenomenon. Though the game does differ from the two other games in its most peculiar genre quite a bit, most particularly in the way it does environment mechanics. And this is the first thing I'd like to talk about before we dive into some of the other nuanced details of the game. The game has two primary core ideas that it does quite different. First, primarily, is the environment mechanics. Now, as you can see on screen, while I am in a cavern here, the environment mechanic doesn't stack up. This means that I'm safe. My health is my health, and that is what it is. But in certain scenarios, and such as on this map, I get a poison aura stacking up until it hits maximum and then starts doing health damage. In areas with a lot of snow and ice, I have to make sure I don't freeze to death. And there's a couple of other ways they deal with this sort of extra mechanic of environment complexity, which means that not only is positioning important in terms of kiting your enemies, or in terms of moving away, or in terms of repositioning yourself, it's also important to keep note that you always keep moving forward. You just can't stand still and wait until enemies come to you. There are situations where you might have to flee just so you can go to a different location and deal with the environmental effects. I do enjoy this mechanic. It creates a bit of a duality in terms of movement, whereas games like Diablo often have the issue where you can stand still and wait until your +1 regeneration ticks in and just go AFK for 15 minutes until it regenerates, and you go on without having to waste health potions, or if you're out of health potions, such as the case may be. In the case of Vikings here, yeah sure, you have regeneration abilities in certain items, but because you have these environmental effects, it is a lot harder to stand still in any specific area and wait until this regeneration hits in, because you will most likely die, and I do like that quite a bit. Now, moving further than that, the game does play on with this nicely in certain of gear departments. And we all know from different games, and be they Diablo or be they Path of Exile or be they anything else in this ARPG genre, is that gear is a bread and butter aspect of this game. Gathering gear, gearing up, building specs around gear types, it's basically the core idea of this game. You run around, kill enemies in various particular or very specific ways, and you do that by building a very specific character build, often centered around specific gear types or specific abilities. In the case of Vikings, getting these gears and gear types set up also means that you have to take care of the environment. Are you going to sacrifice things like armor, or are you going to sacrifice something perhaps like attack speed to deal with the environmental effects in a more efficient manner? And this does translate to different other gear types. Now, gear isn't perfect in this game, and I do feel other games in the genre do a better job of performing gear here than this game does. Gear is very linear and very static. So for example, you'll have gear that gives you plus 15% environmental bonuses. You'll have gear that gives you 5% attack speed. You'll have gear that gives you plus X regeneration. But there aren't a lot of weapons here that say this deals scything blades of fire spewing out from around you and that explode on impact. All of these very, very unique and very over-the-top items that have made games like Diablo the success they are in a large part aren't really here. The gear is very much secondary to the way the game plays with its ability specs, and that is, I feel, definitely to the detriment of the title, which is also my primary critique of this game in most parts, is that the gear is mostly kinda boring. I haven't had a particular need or desire to say, oh, I need to use my axes because this other item I have really synchronizes with that. Most of those things in that are passive, and while yes, getting lots of passive items and passive abilities and passive effects in a game as a smaller development studio is easier, it does also mean that the game is a lot less engaging. Having an item that deals fire damage on a certain situation or a certain percent of the time is fun, but having an item that when you cleave leaves an area of fire around you burning and blazing and you have to use the abilities of that item to your advantage would be better, and the game doesn't really use that to its full effect. Yes, there's different damage types and there's some stuff here and there that does do these things, but by and large, this isn't a primary focus of the way the gear is dealt with in the game, and that is definitely a bit of a shame. Having said that, the way the game deals with speccing up, leveling up, and specializing in certain sets of gear and certain sets of abilities is pretty unique. Before we dive into that, we have to explain how gearing up and leveling up works in this game. So the game uses a set of blood, which is much like experience, as well as 3 resource types you can use to upgrade various things. Blood is used to sacrifice that blood to the gods, and they give you gifts, and these gifts are used to level up specs. Long story short, it's experience, and this experience translates to talent points. You can set these talent points in different spec trees, and these spec trees focus on different things. The one I'm primarily using is Loki's spec tree, which is dual wield. You have things like Thor and Odin and all these other Norse gods that give you things like two-handed weapons, staffs, archery, stuff like that. And that is fairly straightforward. Each of these abilities has 3 levels, and these levels unlock at different levels. If you've played any ARPG, this is pretty much bread and butter for how the games do these things. It's not really different from any other ARPG. But what the game does do slightly different is that it doesn't force you into a specific spec. There is no Necromancer or Amazon or anything else that some of these other games do have. The game lets you free and to pick and choose however you want to deal with it. If you want to spec into dual wield as well as two-handed weapons like I'm doing, you can do that. It's up to you. If you want to go with dual wield and sword and board or sword and board and bow, any other combination thereof, you're fine to do that. You use your gifts to level up, and you then use these gifts to unlock specs. In fact, the game greatly encourages you to do that because the various gifts you get for these talents you unlock allows you to get more points than you would be able to viably spend on your chosen spec. I have more gifts and more talent points available to spec into various abilities than I can reasonably use on my dual wield spec. So that is definitely some part of the game that says, no, you need to branch out, you need to spec into different things, you need to accumulate different abilities and then accommodate those abilities and different attacks and different weapons into different encounters. And that is a pretty cool thing. Now overall, most of the time you basically play the same method. You dodge using the spacebar in the direction of your choice, and you hit enemies where you want to deal with them. And if you hit them in the back, you get a bonus on crit damage, and if you have different buffs, you get bonuses here and there. And obviously, dual wield with 2 weapons is going to benefit your lifesteal and stuff like that. So there's definite reasons to pick one over the other depending on the kind of character you want to build, but there's no overt reasons to say go dual wield over two-handed wield as opposed to games like Diablo or Path of Exile that really tie you into that sort of thing. Now, having said that, we get into the abilities, and here I am both happy and a little bit disappointed. The ability tree is fairly interesting because it allows you 3 things that most other games in this genre don't really do well. Multi-use abilities, where you can combine abilities and effects to a beneficial use as opposed to having a stack of effects that might trigger on a percentual chance, which again is due to gear, not abilities in most other games. Here you have abilities that you have to tie into specific uses, and you unlock these abilities using the ability tree, which you go into as you level up. And you can pick and choose which abilities you want to display and not display, and which levels you want to unlock these abilities at, because each has up to 3 tiers of unlockables depending on level available. All this combined creates a pretty well-defined combat system, which is of course the core of the game experience. Combat is very visceral, in my opinion, better than most other competitors it has. Combat feels fluid, engaging, and because of the dodge mechanic, you are continually moving back and forth between enemies, attack types, different abilities, different weapon combos, because you keep switching to optimize and survive different encounters. Where the game does lack a little bit is the way targeting works, and that is fairly frustrating, which brings me to a second big critique. Is that movement control and targeting control is very subpar and very fiddly. In many situations, I'll be fighting 2 or 3 enemies at any given time, and I'd want to deal with the small fries that I could kill in 1 or 2 blows before I kill the big boss, whereas the smaller fries will doing a lot of damage comparative to how much effort they are to kill. And I wouldn't be able to target these mobs because the big mob would be standing in front of me, or there would be terrain in front of me, or something else that prevented me from attacking that mob at that time. And that is damn annoying because it takes away control that you desperately need to stay alive, to stay moving, to stay engaged with the combat away from you as a player, and sort of puts it into the hands of some mythical creature that says, depending on priority targeting, you might just not be able to do that. And that is damned annoying. In fact, it basically annoyed me so much that I had to switch specs to allow for more AoE oriented combat. Originally, my goal was to play 2 weapon fighting, which is what I'm doing here for most of the time, and then use a bow as my secondary weapon. But I couldn't do that because I was unable to use the bow effectively to target specific targets from longer away. So I switched to a 2-handed weapon so I could just do AoE damage when necessary. Is it a solution? Sure. Is it a good solution? Not really. Having said that, combat overall is very good, and the different variations in combat mechanics, weapons, as well as abilities of these weapons do tie into a variety of cool encounters and cool mechanics where you are sometimes struggling with a specific boss. For example, one boss I had a big shield that blocked most of my one-handed weapon attacks, whereas switching to a different weapon type or a different attack type or different abilities would have made my life a lot easier or even harder depending on what I was doing. A bow and arrow fight would have had a much harder time playing against this boss. So having spoken about combat, the way leveling works, and the way mechanics work, let's talk a little bit about gameplay length and gearing up. As I said, gear is a little bit subpar in terms of dynamic effects, but is very varied in terms of what it offers, both in upgrades as well as in overall gear drops. The game is, as always in the type of games, very heavy on the gear drops, gear mechanics, upgrades, gearing up, and stuff like that. The game allows you to build your own sort of settlement as well, whereas in the settlement you can unlock buildings such as the smithy, the weaponsmith, and other buildings like that allow you to upgrade themselves again and then unlock higher end weapons. Obviously, killing mobs, you're going to unlock the vast majority of your items. But the fact that the game encourages and actually tries to move you in the direction of upgrading your runesmith and upgrading your apothecary really gives a little bit of a more lively feel to something that games like Diablo sorely lack, which is a much more static experience in terms of the home location you start from. You feel more connected to the characters and the encounters you have with these characters in Vikings as it stands, because instead of going back to a location that you don't feel belongs to you, you go back to your town with your inhabitants that you're protecting and you're providing resources for upgrading and leveling up. And this also means that different gear types and different resource types combine into using different methods. Getting resources, iron or wood, while going on raids and while completing maps and objectives on these maps, which can be replayed multiple times for different specific objectives, allows you to then go ahead and upgrade your smithy or craft a new weapon if you want to use that new weapon. You might get a lucky drop in a raid down the line, or you could level up your smithy and get a higher end weapon as it is for a bunch of resources. So this weighing and taking and giving does provide a cool additional layer of choice and complexity that the game does a very good job of introducing. I do like that a lot, which creates more of a choice system as opposed to just running and gunning and killing everything in sight, which you'll still be doing, but on top of that layer, you're also considering the resources you're gaining, whether or not you want to achieve these challenges to get more resources available so you can level up further or upgrade your city further, and so on and so forth. Overall, a very complete experience in terms of the entire package of delivery of gear and combat mechanics. The last part I'd like to talk about is inventory management, because where there's gear, there is management of inventory, and there is a lot of inventory management to be had between the different gear types, from weapons, armors, trinkets, collectible items, and so on and so forth. You'll be spending a lot of time in your gear windows, selling, buying, and trading goods left and right. And I have to say, this is probably one of the least favorite parts of this game I have. There is a large lack of optimization and fine-tuning in terms of user experience in the UI. I don't mean in terms of actual feedback the UI offers to the player during combat. Damage numbers are crisp, interaction is fast, animations are smooth, no issues here whatsoever, and the game is very good on the feedback. But when you enter menus, whether or not that is your inventory or a shopkeeper or something else, everything just bogs down to a very slow grind and halt, where instead of having the ability to right click and sell or just press sell all at any given time, you have to drag and drop every specific item into the sell box of the vendor and then press yes, I want to sell this, and then press yes, I'm certain I want to do this, and then get a window saying you have gotten so many resources for selling this, and then do that with the next item and the next item and the next 55,000 items you have in your inventory. Another issue is comparing things like dual wield. I have to access, and there's no way for me to compare if a new item is better than the offhand axe. And it's these smaller things that do annoy me a little bit. But beyond all of these small minor gripes, the big one is that the UI sometimes just stops working functionally. I will go in my inventory, try to equip an item. You can see it on screen when I'm doing the inventory here, is that I'll spend a good minute moving items into and out of my inventory, trying to equip and unequip a specific set of items for my weapon set, and be unable to do so because for some reason they don't want to be equipped. I have no idea what's going on here, and these minor bugs and issues with the UI in terms of inventory management, in terms of vendor interaction, in terms of selling stuff and getting stuff, it's just a plain old set of frustrating experiences one after the other that provides no positive incentive in my opinion. Sure, it's a good overview, and the overall gifts menu does great, and there's a couple of things here that do a pretty decent job of doing things. But in terms of actual functional UI, it's frustrating. I do hope developers spend some serious time fixing these issues because as it stands, this is very much hampering my enjoyment of the title. Having run through a dungeon or a raid, killed dozens of enemies upon dozens of enemies, gotten a bunch of epic and legendary and very cool loot that does very cool things like ice swords and demon blades and big sights of power, and then trying to equip those and being unable to do so is not fun. Or equipping an item, then checking your inventory a little bit later and then noticing the item is not equipped when you definitely equipped that item. And there's more of these minor issues with the UI and inventory as it stands. So in conclusion, overall, Vikings Wolves of Midgard offers a very interesting ARPG experience, compelling combat system, very good set of varieties in terms of enemies, weapons, encounters, upgrade paths, and everything in between. While it does offer a more limited set of items in terms of active effects, it does still offer a cool set of different weapon types, combos, and unit interactions in terms of build progression. Content-wise, the game is chock full of content, both the type of combat and dungeon raids experiences. Challenges, things like encounters and unique boss fights are pretty diverse, but on top of that, it offers a nice little extra settlement building aspect, which is fairly simple, but does allow you to connect more to something you enjoy as a player in terms of settlement. Sadly, it is hampered by some UI bugs and issues here and there, and the issues with the interface, as I said earlier, in terms of graphical options not being available in the game, does again hamper it a little bit. Overall, as a package, Vikings Wolves of Midgard is an excellent addition to the ARPG genre and does stand, in more or lesser extent, toe-to-toe with the other giants in this genre. It performs an excellent job at providing a unique, cool experience in running in dungeons and killing dozens upon dozens of enemies, and it has a 2-player multiplayer online co-op mode as well. Overall, a pretty complete package. If you want to check out Vikings Wolves of Midgard, there is a link in the description below to the Steam page, and the game comes out on March 24th. For PC. If you like this video, press that like button below. If you didn't like this video, there's a dislike button for exactly that purpose. And leave a comment. Tell us what you liked. Tell us what you didn't like. We want to hear back from all of you. And if you want to see more content like this on the channel, just press that subscribe button down below and we will deliver. And until then, I wish you a good day, and until next time, right here on GuyLogicGaming.